Appreciate the chance to speak with the GAO this morning, and appreciate your work, Mr. Dodaro. Obviously, the responsibility you have is massive. I can't imagine any accounting firm in the country that has a client as big as this one, or as dysfunctional sometimes as this one. And so appreciate the work that you do and the work of your entire team. It's essential, and I wish we were more effective in responding to the identification of concerns that you bring to our attention. I don't have to tell you that one of the great challenges of our nation is a debt of about $22 trillion, which is going to be growing by about $1 trillion a year and into the indefinite future. And if we were to take all the money that the Americans earned this last year, take all of the money that they earned and used it to pay down the debt, why we'd still have more debt to pay down. So it's becoming a very large number, and the interest on that debt is becoming a real challenge as well. I would note that that number is large and growing larger, and certainly presents a certain risk to us. Those of us who've run national campaigns, and there are quite a few in this chamber that have, and some are right now, often talk about balancing the budget with just taking care of waste, fraud, and abuse. I'd like to ask a question which may be impossible to answer because it's not really in your purview to have to add all this together. But I'm wondering if one were able to gather all of the waste, fraud, and abuse that exists throughout government, and to not to reach perfection, not nirvana, but a realistic, if you will, best demonstrated practice that might be employed in either other governments or in corporate America, and to say if we were to be able to apply those techniques and Medicare, for instance, if we were to do as effectively as the best insurer does in preventing fraud and abuse, waste, fraud, and abuse, and among their subscribers. If we were to take those kinds of practices and apply them throughout government, do you have a sense of what the number might be? How much number is available in waste, fraud, and abuse if we were just to apply the best practices that are reasonably existent? Because, for instance, there's a tax gap which is worth $500 billion, but we're not going to close a tax gap entirely. But being realistic, what kind of number might we be looking at?
You know, I think you're basically looking, in addition to the tax gap, there's the current most recent estimate of improper payments. These are payments that were made or were made in the wrong amounts, is $140 billion in the last year. So you have that figure out there, but you're not going to eliminate all of that either. Right. So I think, the bottom line is you can do a lot. The amounts will be maybe in the tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars, but it won't be enough to deal with the unsustainable long-term fiscal path of the federal government. The amount of debt to GDP right now is 78%. It's only been higher one time in our history. Back in World War II, it was 106% of gross domestic product. We are, the Social Security program this year, both the old age portion and disability, will be approaching $1 trillion a year. Both Medicaid and Medicare are on track to achieve individually $1 trillion by 2026. The interest on the Medicaid amount considers state spending as well, so it's not all federal, but mostly. And the interest on the debt is expected to be $928 billion, according to CBO, by 2029. So we're on track for just those areas alone to be $4 trillion before you sort of an opening bid before you fund anything else in the federal government. There is considerable fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government, but not enough to deal with the structural problem that we have between our expenditures and our revenues. And it's going to require the Congress to look at all the entitlement programs, the revenue side of government, in order to get it on a more sustainable path. I've also recommended that the Congress change how it tackles the debt ceiling issue. You know, the current approach is divorced from the appropriation process. And all it does is authorize Treasury to borrow the money to pay the bills Congress and the President have already authorized. And when there's a concern about whether the federal government's going to raise the debt ceiling in time, as we are right now, we're in a debt suspension period. Treasury's taking extraordinary actions. They're actually borrowing against federal retirement funds in order to pay the government's bills until they get the authority from the Congress to borrow more from the Treasury. The interest costs of borrowing our money, if there's concern in the markets, we did a study, it shows the interest rates go up. The markets want more of a premium. Also, some in the markets, Treasury security markets, are avoiding purchasing securities that might mature around the debt impasse ceiling. So it's distorting liquidity in the secondary market. So it doesn't control the debt, it's causing our interest to go up, and it's distorting the markets. And so we need to have a different approach in this area. But we should do everything we can to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. But I've also recommended Congress have a plan to deal with the long-term unsustainable nature of the federal government's budget and to change the debt ceiling. We need to do everything we can never to affect the full faith and credit of the federal government, which if we don't pay our bills on time, that would be broaching, I think, very dangerous territory.
Thank you. For some of us who've been outside Washington for our entire career, the fact that Washington didn't grab the work that was done by Simpson Bowles and the effort that was done by their group was a bit of a mystery. And it does sound like waste, fraud, and abuse might be able to come up with tens of billions of dollars or even $100 billion, but that we have to address the structural challenge that we have in particular with regards to some of our entitlement programs as well as other parts of our spending to avoid, as you say, almost $1 trillion in interest cost. I had the occasion at the end of one of my unsuccessful campaigns to receive a call from a former Democrat president who said, we can't lead the world if we're paying interest like that. And I hope you will help give us some encouragement to move in that direction. I know my time is up. I want to underscore the comment made by our chairman just before he had to leave for another committee hearing with regards to cybersecurity and your agency's suggestions as to how we can organize an effort to actually implement true agency-to-agency cybersecurity would be helpful. And I think his point, which is that you need someone or some group responsible for this across agency and perhaps on a more strategic basis than hoping each agency will just do it on their own. And I don't know how to go about doing that, but you might be able to give us some guidance in that regard.
Yeah. And on that point, Senator Romney, the Department of Homeland Security does have central responsibility for working across the federal departments and agencies. But to address fully cybersecurity issues, in our opinion, you also need to be able to work with the private sector and others. And so DHS is an important component of coordinating across the federal government. But to deal with cybersecurity issues, you need a national strategy to deal with state and local governments as well as the private sector, and that has to be out of the White House.